event in a series of events that we're calling For the People. Today we're going to have Kimberly Cox of our Connect campus talk to us about housing. The whole point of this For the People series is to kind of look at how the government has helped the American people out throughout the years in times of difficulty, in times of need. And housing is one of those areas where the government really has helped out a lot throughout the years. To introduce Kimberly, she's one of our professors of government. She teaches at our Connect campus, and she's been with Tarrant County College for over 20 years. She started out as an adjunct instructor with us. While she was adjuncting for TCC, she worked as a prosecutor, in-house counsel for a mid-sized company, and in private practice. Kimberly got her bachelor's degree from Texas Christian University, and she got her master's degree from Oklahoma City University as well. Also, before we get started, I would like to say thank you to people who have kind of helped put this together. Joan Johnson, Karen Wisely, and Chloe Northrup. This couldn't have been done without y'all's help, and I really do appreciate it. So now, without further ado, let's turn this over to Kimberly, who's going to talk to us today about housing.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to mute my camera and start sharing my screen. One moment, please. All right. Can you see my title slide?
Yes, we can now.
All right, great. So again, thank you. The Fair Housing Act, why I chose it is because I think that a lot of people may not be familiar with it, but it impacts so many of us and has throughout history. And you can see from the word cloud I put on the title slide just how many areas that it does touch on. It's an extremely broad topic, and it was, to be honest, a little hard to kind of narrow it down for this talk. So today I'm going to walk you through briefly a summary of the history of what housing looked like prior to 1968, what the act actually contains, and how it kind of moved forward to today. So in 1968, Martin Luther King gave a speech titled, "I See the Promised Land." I've got a portion of it there on the slide. And it was given on April 3rd, 1968 at the Bishop Charles Mason Temple, of which I have a picture as well. There were hundreds of people that showed up to see him speak, and he'd actually arrived in Memphis with a sore throat and a fever, and wasn't going to give this speech. He actually sent Ralph Abernathy to speak. When Ralph Abernathy got to the facility, he is noted as saying everybody was extremely disappointed. So he calls Martin Luther King Jr. to come speak, and he arrives, gets a standing ovation, and this is, again, a part of the speech that he gives. In the main part of the speech, if you have time to read it, he recounts the hard times that that people of color and minorities have gone through. But he also says that 1968 is one of the best times to be alive for him. And why is, in the speech, he paints this picture of a turning point in time of progress, of real progress. He mentions housing in this speech and the I Have a Dream speech. So housing is really core to what he sees as access to so many in his community and other communities of color. He also urges that this moment in time and is something that will help push through what they've been working on, which is real civil rights action and legislation, which will include fair housing. So after the speech, King goes back to his hotel, and the next morning, on April 4th, 1968, that's where he's gunned down. He's waiting on his balcony for a limousine to take him to dinner at Reverend Billy Kyle's house, and he is only 39 years old at the time. And so the really big question researching for this and looking at this was, how did we get to this point in time? And, when did fair housing come into play? What was going on before this? Why was there such determination to see change in fair housing? And what did fair housing look like, or what did housing in general look like for people prior to 1968? So I'm going to go way back. And I do this on purpose because at the end of the talk, I want to talk about the UN report that mentions Native Americans and African Americans in particular. So I want to start at the very beginning. And at the very beginning of our country, we do see a struggle between where people are going to live, who is going to own land, what land are they going to be able to own. So before the U.S. was an independent nation, early European colonists claimed land from native tribes and forced these native populations to live in designated districts separate from colonial settlements. So these settlements grew, but colonial governments would appropriate more and more from the native population and also limit their rights to own and sell the property. In 1763, the British government does offer some protection of native lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, but following the revolution, the new U.S. government will invalidate those prior agreements and seize a lot of the lands back from the native tribes. So that's one. You can see the map there of the tribes and how much they owned and where. Also, westward expansion would continue the appropriation of native lands, and discrimination by race and religion was also common and permitted by law at the time. For example, we're talking about African Americans, they were forbidden in many places from purchasing land as well. Courts, if they did own land, would also invalidate gifts of land or property transfers to African Americans. And this, again, is going to happen all over the U.S., not just in the South like a lot of people would assume. Free people in the South were eventually allowed to purchase real property, but the barriers to ownership were going to be really high. Few could actually achieve it. The legislature, for example, in Georgia in 1818 passed a law prohibiting persons of color from owning real property at all. In other states, some would allow ownership. Louisiana, for example, you'll see examples where one person will own 2,000 acres, another at 1,000 acres, which is a lot of land back then, but it's going to be few and far between. Maryland, 1860 free blacks owned about 62,000 acres of farmland. Virginia, I was looking for other examples. The amount of land owned by minorities were worth about 463,000. So it really did depend on where you lived, whether you could acquire property or not. And all of this is going to set the stage for land ownership and who could own land, build housing, attain housing, and build wealth early in our country's history. So during the Civil War, Congress will play a part and try to help a little bit. They will pass what are called the First and Second Confiscation Acts. And these acts allow for the seizure of property from Southern rebels fighting against the Union. There was even talk about turning over even more land to freed slaves. And so this first act only looked at property directly used in the war effort by the South. So it would be land specifically used by troops. The second act is going to go further and allow for all Southern property to be seized, regardless of whether it was used in the war effort or not. And the second act also would grant freedom to slaves of the Southern rebels if the U.S. military occupied or overtook rebel land. Now, President Lincoln at the time was really hesitant. He does sign both of these acts after Congress lobbies him that it's necessary. But in the end, he's going to be more focused on restoring the Union. And these acts, his administration will not heavily enforce. Another example can be found at the start of the Civil War in South Carolina. This area, you'll see a lot of upheaval. It is one of the areas that is home to some of the most profitable plantations in the South at the time. And so in November of 1861, the Union took back this area called Port Royal, and they became the authority. Most of the plantation owners at the time had fled, and already the slaves, the freed slaves there, had begun to divvy up the land. Then in 1862, the Union began to organize black regiments, and so this was part of what was going on. And so in that vein, Brigadier General Rufus Saxton, who I've got the picture of there, he comes into the picture. He's one of the advocates for black regiments, and he also is an early outspoken advocate for black land ownership. And he wrote the letter that you see on the screen in December of 1862, urging that land should be set aside for freed people. He says in the letter that speculators are buying up the rich land and displacing freed people, and indicates to how much of a duty it is for the government that the government owes to these freed people. But more importantly, we see an acknowledgement in his letter about how important land is to building wealth and security. And I think that really talks to housing as well. And so I just want to read the highlighted section to give you kind of an idea. It says, a right in that soil to whose wealth they are destined in the future to contribute so largely, to save them from destitution, to enable them to take care of themselves and prevent them from ever becoming a burden upon the country. I would most respectfully call your attention to the importance of the immediate passage of an act of Congress empowering the president to appoint 3 commissioners whose duty it shall be to make allotments of portions of the land forfeit to the U.S. to the emancipated. And just even that last sentence, you see too that he's calling for emancipation as early as 1862. Then at the end of the Civil War, there's a brief period where the government worked also to help ex-slaves obtain land. And this example is from 1865. General Sherman would issue what is technically known as Special Field Order 15. He's located at the time in Savannah, Georgia. And Sherman and his Secretary of War, Edmund Stanton, would hold a meeting with about 20 Black community leaders and ask them what do they want. And land was really the answer. This idea of ownership of a place to live and to have and call your own is going to be the answer. So the land would be for Blacks only at the time, and the order would state that on the islands and in the settlements hereafter established, no white person whatever, unless military officers and soldiers detailed for duty, would be permitted to reside. And so it is still a segregated situation, but they do say by the laws of war and orders of the President of the United States, they are free and must be dealt with as such. So Special Order 15 is often referred to as 40 acres and a mule. It's really interesting that that's the title because it doesn't mention mules in it. It does mention the 40 acres. And what would happen is the military would redistribute the confiscated land and give each freed slave up to 40 acres of land. And so later there's an authorization to lend mules from the military to the people to plow the land and to cultivate it. But the land was about 400,000 acres. And on the map there, you can see it stretched from Charleston, South Carolina to the St. Johns River in Florida. So it's a really large area of land that they're going to be able to divvy up. This is really important. There's an argument that we'd have a profoundly different history in the United States if this and like policies have been implemented and enforced, and that if more people early on had access to ownership of land and property. It would have also allowed for the accumulation and accrual and the passing of along to generations of wealth. So ownership of land and housing really even early on is something that's looked at as a key in this idea almost of the American dream. This plan is great, but it's not long lived. After the assassination of President Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, his successor, is a Southern sympathizer. He will overturn the order, so it lasts less than a year. It's the fall, I believe, of 1865 that he actually overturns it, and the land goes back to the planters who fought against the Union. So federal protection of African Americans in the South does end after Reconstruction and paves the way for what if you have a history class, you'll know as Black Codes in the Jim Crow era. These oppressive conditions then spur this great migration that I've got pictures of. It's a near century long migration north and west by about 6 million African Americans. And it's a prime catalyst, many would say, for the development of racially motivated zoning and housing policies by local, state, and federal government that will basically unfold over the next century. The graphic on the slide compares the early migration of 1910 to 1940. This is sometimes referred to as the first migration as it's labeled. And then the second period is from 1940 to 1970. That's the second Great Migration. So also one thing to know about the migration is that in the early 20th century, strict legislation will limit immigration into the U.S. and bring about a shortage of labor. So that's going to spur some of this. Also, the industrial and manufacturing centers in the Northeast and Midwest would be the beneficiaries of this. These cities will become common destinations for migrants from the South for work opportunities. And cities, what happens in these cities is they will experienced substantial changes in racial composition. You'll see cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia undergo huge changes in who lives in those cities. During and after World War II, Black migrants flooded into many of these cities that were destinations before the war, following friends, relatives that had made an earlier journey. So that's why you get the first and the second almost migrations. So poor economic conditions in the Jim Crow South are another reason for the spur of this large migration. And so you just see an uptick in minority populations both in the West and in the North during these time periods. To go a little bit more into this and to understand this migration, it's important to note that at the turn of the 20th century, 7 of the 9 million African Americans in the U.S. lived in the South. So that's going to be the point of your first migration. So I'll give you an example. The Western migration that this slide is illustrating is really for California. So California, when it joined the United States as a free state, if you look at the U.S. Census numbers, California has 962 Black residents. Many former slaves would gain their freedom here, but the lack of government oversight at the time in California allowed for slavery to flourish in certain regions as well. In 1852, a fugitive slave law would make it illegal for slaves to flee their masters within California. And thus all African Americans in California, born free or formerly enslaved, lived under this constant threat of arrest. Nonetheless, I want to point to the cartoon there from Harper's Weekly. It's titled Difficult Problems Solving Themselves. African Americans and other minorities would continue to move west. They'll come from the deep south, from Virginia, New York, Massachusetts. By 1852, they numbered 2,000, which is about 1% of California's population. And I think the political cartoon is really interesting as an illustration, because if you look in particular at that signpost in the picture, it divides a scene and between the two parallel travel paths dominating the cartoon. And if you look at the bottom, there's a signature by the illustrator, but also the post digs into the ground. It's firmly planted like a tree with roots. And if you look at this, the illustrator and what he was trying to do, he says it's a metaphor for the division in the U.S. that was firmly planted in the American soil at the time. So the signpost was supposed to him occupy middle ground and that blocked compromise, which I thought was really interesting. So anyway, from 1850 to 1860, in this migration, 4,000 African Americans will settle in California during the gold rush period. But even still, approximately 1,000 will be in slavery in the state. And you start to see an example of how the cities are growing. By 1852, for example, San Francisco had the largest urban Black population in the West at 464, and Sacramento was the second with 338. In these cities, you would see Black-owned businesses and Black-owned communities that were thriving. And this is contrasted with the South, where they're migrating out of. I picked Texas because it's our state. In 1860, there were 556 Black bondspeople, or 30% of the population, and only 355 free Blacks in the state. So there's a huge difference. Just want to mention really quick, because the cartoon references it. We're not just talking about African Americans, we're talking about a lot of different minority groups. During this time period, we have 1882, President Arthur will sign the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this act basically is the first law that will ban an entire group of people from entering the U.S. based on their ethnicity. The Yik Wo case is also important in 1886. You start to see with this case early local and state control over where people live and work. So in this particular case, Yik Wo, for example, owned a laundry, and laundry at the time in California was heavily owned by Chinese descendants. And so what happened was they said, you basically have to have a permit to operate a laundry within certain areas. And Yik Wo said no, and he wouldn't pay the permit, and he was basically jailed. And the court gets a hold of the case, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they rule at the Supreme Court level that while the law appeared to be race neutral on its face, everybody's got to pay the permit fee. It was enforced in a discriminatory manner. So we already start to see zoning type laws appear even this early on that we'll go into later. The largest ever migration throughout the U.S. To date is the second migration. This is due, again, for a search for better economic opportunities to avoid harsh segregation laws in the South. And between 1916 to 1930, or let's see, 1916, 1918, sorry, 400,000 moved north. And overall, it's about 6 million again, approximately. The result is we see an explosion of Black communities in the North with Black-owned businesses, hospitals, services, and culture again. And aside from competition for employment, there's also competition for living spaces because these cities become increasingly crowded. Another thing to note at this point that segregation is more normal in the South and legalized through Jim Crow, et cetera. In the North, it's going to be different. There's still going to be racism and where the treatment of people, but it's going to be more based on zoning and housing laws that are going to separate out people where you could live. So after the U.S. Supreme Court declared racially based housing ordinance unconstitutional in 1970, some of these residential neighborhoods will instead enact racial covenants, which I'll talk about later. So anyway, rising rents in segregated areas and a resurgence of the KKK also are going to make worse Black and white relations across the country at this time. So these are just some of the things that are happening during this Great Migration. With this new migration, as mentioned, cities began to pass more zoning laws. Zoning began as a tool to improve blighted neighborhoods, but was transformed into a tool to protect property values by excluding populations described as undesirable. And I've got a few examples there. We have 1908. We have the LA City Council passing its first municipal zoning ordinance in the U.S., which will separate out portions of LA into residential and industrial. And the residential districts prohibited business considered a nuisance or dangerous, and these included laundries, again, lumber yards, and businesses with industrial equipment driven by motors. There is evidence, as I mentioned, that some of these laundries were discriminated towards Chinese residents and citizens, such as in the Yik Wo case I mentioned earlier. In 1910, in Baltimore City, the council passed laws segregating blocks in the city by race as well. And there was a quote from the mayor at the time, it's Mayor Mahul, and I think I'm saying his name right, and he said, quote, that minorities should be quarantined in isolated slums in order to reduce the incidence of civil disturbance, to prevent the spread of communicable diseases to the nearby white neighborhoods, and to protect property values among the white majority. And so within the next 10 years, many other cities such as New Orleans, St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Austin, Kansas City would all be doing the same. Also in 1930, there's something else that's going to impact all this. It's going to be the new tax amendment. And it includes a deduction on interest paid on loans. And really, this is intended early on for business interests, but the deduction becomes a huge advantage to home buyers as well when home loans begin to replace cash purchases a few decades later. So mortgage interest deductions will become a stepping stone to middle-class home ownership because you can exclude part of, for example, initially it was $3,000 and $4,000 for married couples of income from your taxes. And it's important to note that at the passage of the act, less than 1% of the population earned more than that amount. So it's really going to be advantageous for those earning lots of money at the time. And also it's important to note that most didn't own a home or have a mortgage at the beginning of the passage of this act. Prior to this new tax law, most had to save and buy with cash. So there's originally no interest to deduct. It's only when later the government puts in place some of the things through the FHA loans, they'll mention a little bit that that's going to come into play. Then the United States in the Supreme Court case of Buchanan versus Worley strikes down these race-based zoning laws as unconstitutional. They say it's a violation of the 14th Amendment, and you think that would be the end, but the court's decision did not stop cities and towns from nationwide from passing these types of laws. The ruling was widely ignored and instead led to the development of single-family zoning. So that means one house and family per lot. And in a lot of these places, it would also say how large the lot could be. Excuse me. This had the effect of segregating races without mentioning race. And also important is that Buchanan dealt only with state statutes. So left out of it was the federal side of things. This left the door open for private agreements as well, such as restrictive covenants, to continue to perpetuate residential segregation. So the practice of using racial covenants became so socially acceptable that in 1937, communities were awarded quote, these strange things called shields of honor for an umbrella of restrictions against the quote, wrong kind of people. And the practice was so widespread that by 1940, 80% of property in Chicago and Los Angeles, was the data looked at, had restricted covenants barring Black families. If you have a home right now built prior to that time, prior to 1960, really, look at your deed. I know my home was built in the 1930s, and if I look at the deed, there is a racial covenant like this. You can't, those don't go away. The deed is the deed, and those stay in. So if you own a home, it's really interesting to look back at the old portions of your deed. In 1924, the U.S. Commerce Department also gets involved in this a little more. They passed this thing called the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, and it would be used as a model throughout the U.S. states for promoting zoning regulations. 55,000 copies of this thing were sold. It's widely read by the states and those who are regulators. 19 states will pass laws based on it. And the SZEA and the Standard City Planning Act of 1927 lay basically the basic foundation for land use controls in the U.S. moving forward from this point. And you can see on the slide all the power it granted. It's used for health, safety, morals, etc., density of population, location of use of buildings. So it gives the cities a lot of ammunition to kind of set up how they want to zone things. An example from Texas. This is Austin, Texas in 1928, and they're using an SZEA-like plan. And in this particular example, the plan relocates African American and Hispanics to areas where industry mainly was used, which was East Austin. East Austin would contain 90% of all industry and 35% of all commercial businesses. So you're moving a large portion of people into these industrial areas, which is going to impact, the studies will show their quality of life. Then in 1926, in Euclid versus Ambler Realty, municipal zoning regulations were declared constitutional. This is a landmark case in zoning. After this decision, many U.S. cities would take zoning further and eventually zone 75% or more of the residential land use for single-family homes. This makes segregation worse because those that can't afford single-family homes have to live in multi-residential homes. And those are often segregated as well. The result in city decisions to underfund development of parks as well as schools, and to put more nuisances such as garbage dumps and industries in minority communities. Modern studies have shown that these actions contribute to glaring disparities in wealth, health, education, and policing between Black and white communities. These laws still today limit how much multifamily housing can be built in urban areas, which I'll talk about later. The Biden administration is looking at trying to encourage cities to change some of this, and I'll mention that towards the end. With housing shortages and more people moving into urban centers, that's also a current problem that we're seeing as a result of this leftover of municipal zoning. 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created to boost home ownership. This is during the Great Depression, and the FHA would insure home mortgages, but only for houses well inside boundaries of certain neighborhoods. And this leads to industry standards that you may have heard of called redlining. It systematically withholds credit from home buyers and minority that are minority buyers and in minority neighborhoods. It'll favor loans for new suburban construction over older urban properties. And that, looking at those studies, was a contribution to the urban decay and the growth of more suburban areas. The practice of redlining is not declared unconstitutional. I wanted to find out when this was until 1947. And on the map you see there on the slide, you can see the key. So green is best. That's where FHA is going to loan. Blue is still desirable. It's kind of hard to see on there, but the green and blue kind of meld together. Yellow is declining, and red is hazardous. Red is where you were lucky if you could get a loan. Beginning in 1934, the Homeowners Loan Corporation included also an FHA underwriting handbook for residential security maps that would be used, and basically tell lenders what would be off limits for federal-backed mortgages. In 1938, the Congress would create the Federal National Mortgage Association called Fannie Mae, and this was also used to boost home ownership levels. They would make low-cost loans available widely to build mortgages from local banks, and they also secure them. The FHA guidelines severely limited, though, minority access to these mortgages. Only 2% of the 120 billion in new housing subsidies between 1934 and 1962 went to non-whites. And this institutionalized discrimination that would persist even after discriminatory lending was outlawed in 1968. So that's going to be an issue kind of going forward as well. 1944, the GI Bill is passed, and again, this promises new benefits for returning service people. Part of this was not just school that we kind of associate with, but also for low interest home loans. And the problem is that federal defender programs run by the state and the VA weren't funneled towards minorities. And looking through this, VA job counselors often steered minority and women veterans, because we often think, leave out women veterans who apply for tuition or for these programs away from them. There was one comment where, especially speaking to women, that one of the counselors said, look, this is not something you need to worry about. You don't need to worry about school as a woman at this time. So these returning veterans who'd fought for freedom in the war will experience frustration. And I think this will help really spur the civil rights movement, which fair housing is a part of. 1947, we have Leveetown, which is, I have there the symbol of the American dream. Everybody owns their own home, this idea of home ownership. This is Leveetown, New York, and this is the archetype again for the suburban post-war American dream. We'll see with Leveetown, the examples of Leveetown, the first mass-produced large-scale suburban developments. They were meant to provide affordable housing. In particular, this one initially mentioned veterans returning from the war. Financing foreign development was backed by the FHA and the VA, and lease agreements, though signed by the first residents who had an option to buy, were required to include racially restricted covenants, and so applicants from minorities were refused. And so this is going to be a huge problem for many trying to buy into even the suburban dream, depending on, if you're a minority, woman, etc. Again, studies show that it was negative in inequality, social isolation, car dependency, hyper-consumerism later. And it was interesting to look at the arc of this that we're going to see with housing shortages now, with COVID, and people not being able to purchase home because housing prices rising. There are some that say, this idea of the suburban lifestyle, is unattainable even now. Finally, in 1948, the U.S. Supreme Court Shelley versus Kramer decision prevents court enforcement of racially restricted covenants included in deeds. They basically say it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, and they said that the state was acting through the enforcement of these covenants almost as a police power, and that they were denying minorities constitutionally protected property rights. And this leads to something really interesting called block busting by real estate sellers and operators. And so what they would do in block busting, it's the practice of introducing minority homeowners into previously all-white neighborhoods to spark white flight, people leaving those, for housing price declines. The real estate speculators would then use the profit from prejudice-driven market instability, which in the end really hurt everybody, because those people who were fleeing lost money on the sale of their house, and those who were coming in were paying more than they should have. The American Housing Act of 1949 also greatly expanded the federal government's role in housing. It includes significant funding and authorization for the use of eminent domain to clear slums. But by 1974, 2,100 urban renewal projects covering 57,000 acres would cost about $53 billion when complete. In the process, though, 300,000 families were forced to move, with just over half of them being African-American families. So again, shifting where people lived. In 1956, the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act will contribute to where people are living as well. $25 billion were spent on this over 10 years. This is the largest public works in history to that date, and it accelerated suburbanization and leads to blighted urban areas. More money going out to the suburbs, less to the urban areas. So to kind of wrap up this history section, there was a lot to the background of this, but I wanted to kind of give you a really good idea of how where we live was affected by, you know, a lot of factors. So here in this is a timeline of how fast things are going to move up to that speech I mentioned up front and Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. So at this point in time, things are accelerating. In the picture in the top right of the slide, you see an aerial view of clouds of smoke rising from burning buildings. This is Washington, D.C. in 1968. There are riots happening. A restaurant owner in D.C., I found a quote from the Washingtonian, said people were out of control with anger and sadness and frustration. And also you see there in the bottom on April 4th, the King assassination, we see civil disturbances break out in places like Los Angeles, New Jersey, Chicago, Baltimore, all over the country. And as soon as these riots begin breaking out, the army will mobilize also so you have the government coming in, and that's going to cause a lot of friction. Finally, on April 11th, 1968, 7 days after the assassination of Dr. King, President Lyndon Johnson will sign into law Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and it's commonly known as the Fair Housing Act. And this legislation is co-sponsored by Edward Brooke and Walter Mondale, and they were very influential. If you look into this, they still are. They still, their contribution is considerable. The aim of the act was to eliminate housing discrimination and residential segregation. They hoped it would be an important tool for achieving both justice and equality in housing. And in signing the bill, President Johnson said his famous quote, "At long last, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. We've come some of the way, but not nearly all of it." And that was his quote. So what does this act do? The Fair Housing Act makes it unlawful to refuse to sell, rent to, or negotiate with any person because that person's inclusion in a protected class. And we'll go over some of those protected classes in a minute. But while the act, I think, represents progress, dramatic housing disparities persist for a number of reasons that include inconsistent enforcement and lingering housing policy that we've mentioned, predatory lending, bias that we'll talk about here with HUD in a minute. I also wanted to bring forward, and I don't have it on the slide, I was looking at current data from the census on housing, and I looked at 2021 Q2, and this data showed that 44.6% of Black households owned their homes versus 74.5% of white households, and so far this year in 2021. So I think this act, as you'll see, does a lot, and there's a lot of enforcement elements to it, but we still are in the process of working on it. So what else? As we move forward, you can see some of the progress that's made. 1974, there's an amendment to add sex discrimination is prohibited. 1988, Reagan, I've got the picture there, added physical and mental disability and familial status, those with children. The act would apply eventually to all public and private housing types, would extend to residential real estate transactions and the secondary mortgage market, sales, rentals, how they advertise, misrepresentations, blockbusting. You cannot coerce, intimidate, threaten, or interfere with those exercising their FHA rights. So there's a lot in the act, and it's a long piece of legislation, but that kind of gives you an overview, hopefully. And all of this is regulated by HUD. I also, and I'm not going to give you all the details of these cases, but I did want you to see that the court has also been involved. So 68, we're looking at can Congress regulate private transactions when it comes to FHA and racial discrimination? The answer is yes. I kind of skip down. 1976 was housing, looking at municipal boundaries. Can they change those to affect more fair housing? And the answer is yes. Can minority applicants who are discriminating against sue their landlord? Yes. Testers, can you send in testers? People to test whether someone is doing something discriminatory in either renting or selling houses. And the court said, sure, that's fine. And then sexual harassment is also prohibited. And in 1987, they also look at school desegregation in housing. So the court's been extremely involved. This one is kind of a technical thing, but I think it's important in looking at this. HUD passes what's called disparate impact regulation. It's a discriminatory effects liability piece. So HUD formalizes this idea, and I'll kind of read it off there. They say that the appeals courts recognize that liability under the Fair Housing Act may arise from a facially neutral practice that has a discriminatory effect, even if the practice was not motivated by discriminatory intent. And what I say with that is, even though they didn't mean to discriminate, if they do, if say on its face it doesn't look discriminatory, they didn't mean to do it, but if the impact or effect is discriminatory, that's going to be a problem under FHA. Also, under the Obama administration, they got really serious and they passed in 2015 the Furthering Fair Housing regulations, which really spurred from the federal side, pushing states to kind of up their game. Recipients of, basically funding from HUD needed to really look at how their cities were zoned and how fair housing was being implemented. And they just really kind of pushed further FHA rules and what needed to be done. In 2018, under the Trump administration, this rule was suspended, and HUD withdrew the assessment tool that they were using. Trump said that it was that the rule was hurting suburban areas. And in 2020, right at the end of the Trump administration, or towards the end of the Trump administration, AFFH was repealed. This June in 2021, the Biden administration did restore it, and you can see on the slide what it does. So going back to the disparate impact really quick, this is a Texas case. They tested the disparate impact, whether does it really mean, if you didn't mean to discriminate, do you have to, still fix the problem under FHA? And the court really said yes. On June 25th, the U.S. Supreme Court decided against Texas and said that disparate impact is a reasonable interpretation. And so if you're going to have a law put in place on fair housing, you have to make sure that not only is it non-discriminatory on its face, but also in its impact and effect. So these next few slides I'm going to go through pretty quick, but this is the tools that are being used. This is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And you can see they have a lot of things that they work on in housing: foreclosure, buying a home, home sales, senior citizens, homeless veterans. But they also get fairness in lending, discrimination, and rental assistance as well. So I wanted to go through on their site. They have a few examples, and I'm going to see what you guys, that you can kind of just on your own, because I can't see the chat, what you think. But this is John, who's a Black man, speaks to a prospective landlord on the phone about leasing an apartment. And on the phone, the landlord seems eager to rent to John. But when John meets with the landlord in person to fill out the application, the landlord's attitude is entirely different. A few days later, John receives a letter saying that his application was denied because of a negative reference. John is surprised because he never had problems with this landlord, and the landlord says, never gave you a bad reference. John suspects the real reason is he was denied an apartment because he's Black, so John files a complaint with HUD. And is this discrimination? And I'll give you a second to think. And the answer is yes. If HUD investigates it, and this is part of a real case, by the way, the landlord files show a pattern of discrimination because of race and color. So this one, Jane, has a housing voucher, but 1 month she falls behind on her portion of the rent. When Jane asks her landlord if he will give her a few more days, the landlord says yes, but only if she will go out with him. Feeling she has no choice, Jane says yes. And so over the next few days, Jane's landlord sends her sexually explicit text messages, even though Jane says stop. And Jane's landlord tells her that if she does not go out with him again, he's going to evict her and she will lose her voucher. Is this discrimination? This sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination under FHA, and a complaint should be filed with HUD. So steering's another one that's kind of different, but John, who's an Asian man, meets with a real estate broker to discuss purchasing a house for his family. When John names the neighborhood that he's interested in, the broker asks John if he is sure that his family will feel comfortable there. The broker tells John that she has a wonderful listing in another neighborhood. where there are more people like them. When the broker takes John to see the house, John notices that the residents appear to be mostly Asian. Is this discriminatory? And the answer is yes, that is steering. So if you're steering people to different neighborhoods based on their race, you can't do that either. This one has to do with disability. Jane has a developmental disability that affects her capacity to manage her own finances. Jane tells her building manager that her mother will be paying her rent for this reason and asks if all notices relating to her rent can be sent to her mother. The building manager tells Jane that the management company has a policy of sending notices only to the residents, no exceptions. Several months later, Jane receives an eviction notice because her mother had not known that Jane's rent had been increased. Is this discrimination? And it is. It's denying a reasonable accommodation in the form of disability discrimination. Children, so with familial relations that's added during the Reagan era, this is going to apply to this, has 3 teenage children. John's building has a patio with picnic tables, and one day John's children decide to have lunch. The next day, John receives a notice from the Homeowners Association informing him that the building rules say the patio is adult use only and he needs to make sure the children do not violate these building rules. Is this discrimination? And this one's a little harder, but it can be. John can file a complaint under HUD because the building rules that discriminate against children are a form of familial status discrimination, possibly. One more, this has to do with where you're from. John recently moved to the United States from Mexico. One day John sees that there is a new tenant in the apartment next to his, so he welcomes her to the building. John's neighbor comments on how nice everyone in the building seems, especially the building manager who offered to waive her security deposit because she seems like a good person. John is surprised because the building manager was short-tempered with him and said that John's accent made him hard to understand. John later asks around and finds out that the building manager also has waived fees and deposits for other tenants he likes, but not for him or other persons from Mexico. Is this discrimination? And on this one, yes, they said yes, because providing different terms and conditions to tenants because of national origin is illegal discrimination. I think this is the last one, yeah. A transgender woman is asked by the owner of her apartment building not to dress in women's clothing in the common areas of the property. And I had a second one on here. A gay man is evicted because his landlord believes he will infect other tenants with HIV and AIDS. So are these discrimination under FHA? And maybe. This is one of the kind of stranger areas I'll talk about. Both sexual orientation and gender identity are protected under FHA. However, there is no express prohibition. Many of the courts, though, have concluded that anti-LGBT discrimination in the form of sex discrimination, should not happen. So it kind of depends on the federal court you're in right now. Under example 1 above, in the case I looked at, the nonconformity of gender stereotypes is likely protected, and most of the courts it was, some weren't. And under example 2, above disability discrimination under FHA, the HIV/AIDS will fall under not sex discrimination, but disability discrimination. So that's why this one's a little harder to answer. It kind of depended. Also, 22 states and the District of Columbia do provide additional protections for LGBTQ members. Texas is not one of those, so that complicates things. There's not a uniform decision by the courts on this yet. So those are some examples, and the enforcement arm of this is here, the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity arm of HUD. They put out an annual report, so I pulled their most current one, which is 2020, and you can see they investigate, conduct compliance reviews, and increase public awareness, manage housing grants, and ensure civil rights in HUD programs. So that's who they are. In their report, pulled some of the data for you. You can see the number of investigations in 2020 and the cost. And note the 3 top areas: disability, race, and retaliation are the 3 top numbers of complaints. This one also too, they break it down even further. This report's very detailed. For example, disability was the highest one. It was surprising, I guess it shouldn't be. We're 60.9%. And then I like the one on that's the bigger graph, because it tells you exactly discriminatory refusal to sell, to rent. It kind of breaks it down a little bit more if it's steering, redlining, denying or making housing unavailable. So in this report, they break it down as well. This again is an overview of how many cases they closed, number of complaints, There's 76 agencies under this working on all of this and providing information. And Fair Housing Organization Initiative, they do put money into that as well, education and outreach and private enforcement. So they put a lot of money and time into this. This one is HUD's Enforcement Management System from September 30th, 2020 graph on the top 3, disability, race, and sex. And I think what was surprising to me was if you're looking at 2016 to 2020, the lines are fairly steady. Disability is going down a little bit, but not much. So these numbers for the last 4 or 5 years are hanging pretty steady on the graph. Where do I think the next cases could be? LGBTQ, DACA, and income were some of the ones as I researched looked like they might be places where we'll see cases on this. On the yellow box, the LGBTQ are less likely to own their homes, or more likely to be renters and more likely to be homeless. These were some of the data I was getting. 15% higher odds of being poorer than cisgender straight adults after controlling age, race, urbanicity, etc. And there was a case Bostock versus Clayton in June that dealt not with this specifically, but dealt with when you could fire someone. And a lot of the experts in this area, as I was researching it, thought that the same argument could be made in FHA discrimination cases for LGBTQ. So I'm thinking that possibly there's an opening to add more protection for LGBTQ homeowners and renters in this area. DACA, there have been recent cases where those under DACA status have had a hard time purchasing or renting a home lately. The Biden administration has announced that federally insured homes would be available to DACA holders. I think that a lot of these cases could be done under that national origin as well. But again, if you're born here in the States, that's kind of the hard part for that. So I think the Biden administration is going to try to help out DACA discriminatory treatment, but we'll have to kind of wait and see. The big one is income because of the housing prices going up, the lack of housing stock. Brookings and Gallup did studies showing that homes in the majority Black neighborhoods are valued at $48,000 less on average than comparable white neighborhoods, for a total loss of this huge number of $156 billion. This one's a little harder. I'm not sure how they're going to do this. Maybe it's not a case that'll come up, but more of the administration getting in there and really kind of looking at how they can enforce the regulations for zoning, et cetera, better, and how there's a bunch on lending that possibly cases on lending and for homes, purchase of homes, I think could be a case. So those are the 3 areas. The Biden administration is moving quickly. The memo on redress internations and federal government's history of discriminatory housing and practices and policies is on the White House website. And in this, they mention as some of their priorities, racial equality and strengthening for housing. He also did an executive order in January that they will enforce and go after those who discriminate based on gender identity and sexual orientation, again, to help out the LGBTQ community. In July, had made over 19 million available to fight housing discrimination. Much of that was focused on COVID and people, being kicked out of their places, kind of putting a moratorium on landlords kicking out people or basically who can purchase homes and how. Freddie Mac also showed a shortage of 3.8 million housing units at the end of 2000, and Redfin data showed 50% decrease in the number of houses sold. In the inventory, there's just not the inventory for this. The UN did a study where about 60% of us in the US, it broke it down by country, will live in urban areas, and there's just not enough housing for that. So, and there's not enough multifamily housing as well. The zoning laws that I mentioned for multifamily and single family housing, and I've got this slide and one more, really are going to have to be addressed. The current zoning laws limit how many multifamily units you can have in cities to the 1999 level, which is too low. And so right now the Biden administration is put $5 billion out there and said, hey, cities and states, if you want to take advantage of this money to redo those zoning laws, we'll help you out. In California, I know is one state that they did it statewide recently, but there's also been a lot of studies out there about how we can do this better. And Vienna, Austria is one of the models. If you look up the Vienna model, all over the UN the U.S. and New York, Chicago, L.A., other countries, Japan and Tokyo, they're looking at doing something similar to this. And this Vienna model is really interesting because what they build is the pictures are of, I'm going to probably mispronounce this, but passive houses. They're ultra low energy buildings that are eco-friendly, durable, and sustainable. And their affordable housing may be hard to replicate because it's largely funded by federal taxes. They subsidize affordable housing constructions. They rehabilitate buildings, and they also preserve buildings. Say there's gentrification, they'll come in and update those buildings or preserve them. And 60% of Vienna's population lives in social housing, and rents are set so that people there pay no more than 30% of their income. So once you go over this threshold income too, you're not forced to move out. So it allows those people to build wealth, have more disposable income to throw back into the local economy. So it's been really successful there. There's no housing shortage. There's no year-long waiting lists like we have here for subsidized housing. No mad scramble to pour money into the real estate market to try to get a house if you can get one. So I know we can't put a link, but that Bloomberg.com news there at the bottom is a short video. I think it's 10 minutes on this idea, and it's, if you're interested, it's really worth looking at. Again, it may be hard to replicate here in the U.S., but I think it's something that we could look at. There's others. The Finland Housing First model, we do some of that here. It's the idea of you provide housing first, then services, then get people back on their feet, and versus that they have to get the help and be on their feet before they can get a house and move into the workforce. So we have a kind of mixed model for that, whereas other places have the housing first model, which seems to work for them. And lastly on this, before I move into the last slide with the resources, is that the UN has said that the stats for 2020 on homelessness in the U.S., they said that in 2020, about 580,000 people here in the U.S. experienced homelessness. 61% were in shelters or transitional housing, while 38% were just out on the streets or in abandoned buildings. And they also provided this stat, to circle back to my first part of the history, that this was the 4th year in a row that homelessness increased, and African American and Indigenous peoples remain considerably overrepresented in this homeless population number. So that's, there's a real reason why we need to continue, which we have done and we are doing, but we need to continue to work on this and look for creative, innovative models, such as the Vienna model. What pieces can we take from it? And again, this is a huge area. There's a lot to it, as I've kind of outlined. And this really was an outline. It was hard to condense down even to this amount. But if you want to know more, HUD.gov, Texas.gov, the TWC, and then there's a Texas.gov housing assistance. Texas Department of Housing Community Affairs also has information, but this is one here in the bottom of the Texas State Law Library that you might not know about. And they have legal advocacy organizations on housing, and they link you out to all these federal and state resources as well. So there's a lot of resources out there. I think that just people, get out there and do your research. There's lots of ways to get involved in this and think about, how can we as individuals get involved through working with our cities and our communities to understand the laws that are in place, and the history and the background of how, housing has come about. I did a talk recently on climate change, and one of the things that came up on that was climate migration because of heat in the South, or say lots of wet or drought on the coast. And our cities, if people migrate north to avoid this, going to be ready? Are we in the South going to be ready for this with our housing? And right now, it doesn't look like we're super prepared. I think, we've got the technology and we've got, the innovation to do this, and it's really positive. And that's what I've got for you guys. And I appreciate y'all listening. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Kimberly. We really do appreciate that. Let's see. As far as questions, one question we have here is there any indication that housing discrimination has decreased since 1968?
Sorry about that. I muted myself for a second. There is, the data does show that we have come a long way. We really, really have. And there are a lot of cities around the country that are extremely innovative and are working to address the problem. But one thing I ran into in my research is that, and why I spent so much time on the history part of it and the law part of it, is that a lot of we've got to kind of retweak some of that. Some of the it seems like the vestiges of what had happened are still prohibiting us today from, I think, reaching bigger numbers of people being able to afford a home or get into better housing situations. There is discrimination. That discrimination number has come down, but affordability really is one of the big areas that concerned me the most after looking into this.
Okay. So another question here, if someone believes that they have been discriminated against, what government agency should they contact? And then another question with that is, what are the penalties for discriminating in housing?
Yeah, and without going into a lot of detail, Texas Workforce Commission, Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs are the state arm of that. You can also go to HUD. There's a process listed on their websites if you want to file a complaint, and it will be investigated. You know, I think that's the easiest way. I guess you could sue someone, you could sue your landlord, etc. But I think that can be, and this is just from my perspective, being my previous job in the law, let's put it that way, that can be expensive for a lot of people. So going through the state or the federal agency, if you don't get anywhere with the state arm, you can go to the federal arm, through HUD. But going through that complaint process, having them do that investigation might be the route to go. I always recommend, though, if you can talk to an attorney, at least get a consultation meeting because that's always helpful to have that representation, even if you're going through this process. So, and if you can't afford, there are some entities like Legal Aid, but I know the Texas Bar Association has a lawyer referral section where you get the first 30-minute consultation for, I believe, like $20, $25. It's really cheap. I haven't looked at the pricing in a while, but it's not after that 30 minutes, so it's going to cost you money. So I always tell people, if you use it, ask real quick how much this is going to cost after the 30 minutes. But there are resources like Legal Aid and through the referral services that you can also look for your own representation if you need it.
Okay, and as far as penalties, if someone is found guilty of discrimination, is it mainly monetary? Is there jail time involved?
Most of it looked like it was monetary. It could involve jail time, but most of it looked monetary. There was some injunctive relief where you could stay in your home, for example, but a lot of it looked monetary. That looked like the general.
Okay, another question here, I think you did kind of touch on some of it, but so this question asks, do you know what efforts are being made to improve housing under the Biden administration? But more specifically, this question, are there any proposals in the various infrastructure bills?
There are, well, I'll go with yes, the Biden administration is working to address this. He's been very specific about LGBTQ and sexual orientation discrimination. He's also talked specifically about disability discrimination, since someone in his office obviously is aware that those are the highest numbers. DACA was another one, mentioning relief for those who are DACA, under the DACA program, being discriminated against. And in the big infrastructure bill that's being debated, yes, this is a part of it. There is a section in there. One of the problems, I think it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I may be wrong on that, but I think AOC introduced a bill in the House to repeal that law that said you can only build so many multi-housing units, the zoning laws I mentioned. It passed the House, but got stalled in the Senate, and I think that the infrastructure bill tries to touch on that as well, but the way they've gotten around that is the Biden administration has offered that $5 billion as an incentive for states and cities to go ahead and change their zoning laws. So they're really pushing, how can we get creative to get around this? If Congress won't pass it, how can we maybe get states and cities to do it? So I think that the Biden administration looks like they're being proactive. They know it's an issue. They know that there's a housing shortage right now, and that If you can get a house, it can be extremely expensive right now. Housing prices all over the country have skyrocketed. So everything I've seen, they look aware of it. They look like they're trying to address it. And yes, they are touching on it within the infrastructure bill as well, the package.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Kimberly. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
This.
I hope it was informative and helpful. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And thank all of you who attended as well. Be sure to check in the chat. There's a link for a Google Doc where you can put your name and your professor's name so you get counted as having been here. This is the first in our series of presentations on For the People. We will have another one coming up in October, and we'll get those flyers out and all the information out. So thank you, everyone who was involved. Thank you again, Kimberly, for speaking, and have a nice day, everyone. Bye.